In a remote village, nestled within the heart of an ancient forest, stood a grand hermitage, home to a revered Buddhist teacher. The hermitage was a place of deep contemplation, where seekers from far and wide came in pursuit of wisdom. Among the many disciples who lived there, one stood apart, not because of his knowledge or discipline, but because of his incessant chatter. He was known to talk endlessly, collecting stories from every house he visited while seeking alms and eagerly sharing them with his fellow disciples. This disciple was not merely talkative. He had a habit of gossiping, spreading stories about others, and presenting himself in a favorable light. He often spoke ill of one disciple to another, only to turn around and act kindly in front of those he had just criticized. He delighted in boasting about his background, constantly reminding others that he had come from a wealthy family. "If I wished," he would say, "I could have led a life of luxury, but I abandoned all that to seek the truth, to discover myself, to understand life. My sacrifice is far greater than any of yours." The teacher of the hermitage was wise and observant, deeply aware of the nature of his disciples. One day he gathered them all together and spoke. "For the next month, each of you must take a vow, a resolution. This will test your strength of will and deepen your inner power. Choose a vow that suits your ability, but know this: if any of you break your resolution before the month is over, you must return to your old ways, unchanged." The disciples, eager for self-improvement, selected vows according to their capabilities. Some vowed to meditate for longer hours, others to fast or perform acts of service. But the talkative disciple, unable to resist setting himself apart, approached the teacher privately. "Master," he said, "I do not wish to take an ordinary vow like the others. I want a great and difficult vow, one that is worthy of my ability. Please tell me what resolution I should undertake." The teacher smiled knowingly and replied, "Are you certain? The vow I assign you may be beyond your capability." The disciple, filled with pride, insisted, "No matter how difficult it is, I will fulfill it without fail." The teacher nodded. "Very well. For the next month you must remain completely silent. Not a single word shall escape your lips." The disciple was taken aback. "Is that all, Master? This is too simple. I was expecting something far more challenging. Silence for a month? That is no great feat. Give me something more worthy of my strength." The teacher simply said, "First, fulfill this vow. Then we shall see." Determined to prove his worth, the disciple fell silent from that moment on. At first he found it easy. The first day passed smoothly. But by the second day, an unspoken weight began to press upon his chest. On the third day, a strange restlessness crept into his mind. By the fourth, he felt as though he were suffocating. He longed to speak, to share his thoughts, to assert himself among his peers. He watched as the other disciples conversed, exchanged stories, laughed and debated. He wanted to participate, to offer his opinions, but his vow restrained him. His mind, so accustomed to external expression, now turned inward, and the voices within grew louder. He resorted to making exaggerated facial expressions, using gestures in place of words, but it was not enough. His frustration deepened. A few more days passed, and the silence began to take its toll. His head ached, his appetite waned, and his mind felt as though it would burst. He could think of nothing but speaking. The more he resisted, the stronger the urge became. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he went to his teacher and wrote down his plea. "Master, I must speak. I feel as though I am suffocating. My breath is heavy. My mind is in turmoil. I am losing myself in this silence. What should I do? Should I break my vow?" The teacher read the disciple's words and smiled. "Resolutions are easy to take but difficult to keep. Many make promises, but few have the strength to fulfill them. If you cannot bear this silence, then break your vow and return to your old ways. But remember, if you are unable to uphold a simple resolution like this, how will you ever control the greater struggles of your life? The disciple was deeply shaken by these words. Without another plea, he bowed and left, locking himself in his hut. He refused to give in to his weakness. He ventured outside only when necessary, but otherwise remained in seclusion, determined to endure the vow he had taken. Days turned into weeks. One by one, the other disciples broke their resolutions and returned to their former routines. But the talkative disciple persisted. He had not spoken a single word since the day he took his vow. The hermitage was astounded. How had the most talkative among them transformed into a figure of silence? After 15 days, he returned to his teacher, writing his thoughts once again. "Master, I have remained silent from the outside, but inside, my mind is restless. My thoughts are loud, constantly questioning, doubting, speaking. The more I suppress my voice, the louder my inner world becomes. Have I truly kept my vow?" The teacher responded, "Your vow continues, but know this, your mind is accustomed to noise. As long as you remain surrounded by the voices of others, your own mind will never be silent. If you wish to experience true silence, you must distance yourself from external distractions." The disciple bowed, understanding what he must do. The next morning, he left the hermitage and walked into the dense forest. Days passed. His absence grew longer. The time of his resolution came to an end, but he did not return. The disciples of the hermitage grew anxious. Had he been lost to the wilderness? Had he fallen prey to the dangers of the forest? They searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Some accepted that he was gone forever, believing the wild had claimed him. But the teacher remained calm. When another disciple asked, "Master, do you think he has perished?" The teacher replied, "Perhaps the forest took him, or perhaps he found what he sought." "Is silence truly so dangerous, Master?" the disciple asked. The teacher chuckled. "The greatest burden of humankind is that we cannot remain silent. We are always speaking, sometimes with words, sometimes with thoughts. We talk more than we listen. We argue to prove ourselves right. We speak without awareness, and in doing so, we create conflict and suffering. Families break, friendships falter, and misunderstandings arise, not because of silence, but because of reckless words. If people could learn the power of silence, they would understand how much energy is wasted in unnecessary talk, but few realize this truth. The disciple listened, deep in thought. "So, what is the solution, Master?" The teacher smiled. "Watch your thoughts. Observe them without attachment. Be fully present in the moment. Do your work with awareness. Silence is not merely the absence of speech, it is the mastery of the mind." 3 months passed. The talkative disciple remained missing. The others had long given up hope of his return. Then, one day, he walked back into the hermitage. The sight of him left everyone astonished. He was not the same man who had left. A profound change had taken place within him. His face radiated tranquility, his eyes shone with a deep and unshakable peace. His fellow disciples rushed to him, surrounding him with excitement. He spoke to them, but his words were different, calm, measured, and filled with a quiet wisdom. At last, he approached his teacher, bowed, and asked, "Master, have I kept my vow? Am I still silent?" The teacher gazed at him for a long moment before replying, "Yes, you are truly silent now." The disciple knelt before his teacher, the weight of his journey evident in his calm and steady presence. The teacher studied him, his gaze searching for something beyond mere words. A knowing smile played on his lips as he finally spoke. "You are silent now," he affirmed, "not because you do not speak, but because the storm inside you has settled. Your words are no longer a flood, but a gentle stream, flowing only when necessary." The disciple bowed his head in gratitude. "Master," he said, "when I first took the vow of silence, I thought it would be easy. I believed silence was simply the absence of words. But as the days passed, I realized how wrong I was. The true battle was never with my tongue, but with my mind." The other disciples gathered around, eager to hear his story. His transformation was evident. Even his breathing was slow and measured, his presence radiating an undeniable serenity. Gone was the restless energy that had once defined him. In its place was something deeper, something unshakable. The disciple continued, his voice soft yet firm. "In the beginning, I believed I was controlling my silence, but in truth, it was controlling me. I was consumed by the urge to speak, to express, to be heard. It felt as though my very existence depended on my words. My mind became a relentless torrent of thoughts, replaying old conversations, rehearsing new ones, questioning, arguing, defending. Even in silence, I was drowning in noise." He paused, his gaze distant, recalling those difficult days. "I sought refuge in solitude, thinking that if I could escape the voices of others, my mind would quiet. But it did not. In the forest, surrounded by nothing but the whispering trees and the murmur of the wind, the noise within me only grew louder. It was then that I understood. Silence is not found in the absence of sound. It is found in the absence of resistance." The teacher nodded approvingly. "And what did you do when you realized this?" The disciple took a deep breath, as if reliving the moment. "At first, I fought. I struggled against my thoughts, trying to silence them, to suppress them, to force them into stillness. But the more I fought, the louder they became. It was like trying to calm a storm by shouting at the wind." A ripple of laughter spread through the disciples, but it was not mocking, it was understanding. They too had battled with their restless minds. "Then," the disciple continued, "something changed. One night, exhausted from the battle, I simply stopped fighting. I sat beneath a great tree, closed my eyes, and surrendered. I allowed my thoughts to come and go, without clinging to them, without pushing them away. I did not engage with them. I did not resist them. I simply observed." The air grew still as the disciples listened, captivated. "And then," he whispered, "the silence came. Not the silence of the forest, nor the silence of my tongue, but the silence within. A silence so deep, so vast, that for the first time in my life I truly heard. The rustling of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the soft rhythm of my own breath, all of it clear, unclouded by the endless chatter of my mind. And in that moment I understood what you meant, Master." The teacher's eyes gleamed with quiet pride. "And what was it that you understood?" The disciple smiled, his expression serene. "That true silence is not an absence of speech, but an absence of self. The self that argues, that justifies, that clings to identity and status. The self that seeks approval, that fears being wrong, that constantly needs to prove its worth. When that self falls away, all that remains is awareness, presence, peace." The hermitage was silent, not from obligation, but from reverence. Every disciple present felt the weight of those words settle deep into their hearts. One of them, unable to contain his curiosity, finally asked, "But how do we attain that silence? How do we quiet the mind?" The disciple turned to him, his voice gentle. "You do not silence the mind. You watch it. You listen without attachment, without judgment. You allow it to be, just as you allow the wind to blow, the river to flow. And in doing so, the noise fades on its own. You do not need to force it. Silence is always there, beneath the noise. You must simply become still enough to hear it. Another disciple, still grappling with the idea, frowned. But what if thoughts never stop? What if the mind continues to speak? The teacher interjected then, his voice filled with warmth. Then let it speak. The mistake is believing you must stop your thoughts in order to be silent. But silence does not mean the absence of thought. It means not being enslaved by it. Let the thoughts rise and fall like waves upon the ocean, but know that you are not the waves. You are the ocean. The disciple who had returned from the forest nodded in agreement. "That is why I am still silent, Master," he said. "I speak, yet I am silent. I listen, yet I am silent. Even in the noise of the world, I remain in solitude. For the silence I have found is not one that can be broken by words." A deep hush settled over the gathering, heavier than any silence before. It was not the silence of words withheld, but of understanding shared. It was the silence of realization, of wisdom, sinking into the depths of the soul. After a long pause, another disciple spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this is the key to true peace?" The teacher smiled, his gaze sweeping over his students. "It is the beginning. Peace is not something to be found. It is something that is revealed when all else falls away. When you stop seeking, stop clinging, stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, peace is what remains. It has always been there. You were simply too loud to hear it." The disciples sat in stillness, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow more present than ever before. They had come seeking wisdom, yet what they had found was something deeper, something that could not be spoken, only experienced. And in that moment, they understood. The true lesson had never been in words. It had always been in silence. The disciple sat before his teacher, his mind no longer restless, his heart no longer weighed down by the need to prove himself. He had returned from the forest not as the man who had left, but as someone transformed. The old habits, the old impulses, the incessant need to speak, they had all withered away like autumn leaves surrendering to the wind. And yet he had not become empty. Instead, he was filled with something new, something profound. The other disciples watched him in awe. He had been the most talkative among them, a man who could never hold his tongue, and yet now he sat before them with a calmness that could not be disturbed. He had found something they all sought, yet had never grasped. And now they wanted to know. One of them hesitated before asking, "But what if we cannot do as you have done? What if we cannot silence the voices in our minds?" The disciple turned his gaze upon his questioner, his eyes steady yet kind. "You are asking the wrong question," he replied. "It is not about silencing the voices. It is about no longer being ruled by them. You do not need to chase them away. You need only to stop believing in their urgency." The disciple who had spoken frowned in confusion. "But how?" The former talker smiled gently. "Do you try to silence the river? Do you stop the wind from blowing? No, you let them flow, you let them pass. The river does not hold on to its waves. The wind does not cling to its direction. And yet, we hold on to our thoughts as if they are the essence of who we are. This is the illusion." The teacher, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. "You have seen the truth." The disciple bowed his head. "I have seen only a glimpse, Master, but that glimpse has changed everything." Another disciple, younger and still filled with impatience, shook his head. "But why is it so difficult? Why is it that even when we wish to be silent, the mind refuses to listen?" The returned disciple took a deep breath. "Because we have spent our whole lives feeding the mind. We have trained it to seek distractions, to chase after thoughts, to find comfort in noise. Silence feels unnatural to us because we have never truly experienced it. We think we are afraid of loneliness, but in truth, we are afraid of meeting ourselves. The words hung in the air like the toll of a great bell. The disciples shifted uncomfortably, for each of them had felt that fear before. The fear of sitting alone with their own thoughts, of facing the unfiltered nature of their own minds. But is silence really the answer? One of them asked after a long pause. Surely words have their place. Surely speaking is not always harmful. The teacher, who had been listening patiently, nodded. Words are neither good nor bad. It is our attachment to them that creates suffering. We use words to escape from ourselves, to shape the world as we wish it to be, rather than seeing it as it is. But when one learns the art of silence, words regain their true power. They are no longer weapons. They are no longer walls. They become bridges, tools of wisdom rather than instruments of the ego. The disciple who had returned from the forest smiled. That is why I speak now, and yet I am silent. My words are no longer an escape. They no longer seek approval or attention. They simply are. One of the elder disciples, who had spent many years in meditation but had never known such peace, leaned forward. And this peace you have found, does it stay with you always? The former talker paused, considering the question carefully. Peace is not something that stays or goes, he said finally. It is something that is always present. It is only our own noise that hides it. When I was in the forest, there was a moment when all my thoughts vanished, when the mind ceased its endless talking. And in that moment, peace was not something I had to seek. It was simply there, as it always had been. I was the one who had been absent. A hush fell over the gathering. The teacher smiled, seeing the understanding begin to take root in his disciples. You have grasped the essence of true silence, he said. But tell me, now that you have returned to the world, where noise surrounds you once more, has your silence been disturbed? The disciple bowed his head. No, Master, for I have learned that silence is not in the world. It is within. The world may be noisy, but I am not. A murmur passed through the disciples. This was a realization they had not yet reached. Many of them had believed that in order to find peace, they had to withdraw from the world. They had to escape to the mountains, to the forests, to places where silence reigned. But here was someone who had found silence within himself, regardless of his surroundings. One of them finally spoke. Then does this mean we do not need solitude to find peace? The teacher answered this time, solitude is a teacher. It strips away the distractions, forces you to face yourself, and reveals the truth that was always there. But once you have learned, once you have seen, you can return to the world without losing what you have found. You do not need to escape life to be at peace. You need only escape your attachment to noise. The disciple who had returned from the forest nodded. When I first left, I thought I had to go far to find silence. But now I understand that it is always here, beneath the surface. And so, whether I'm in the forest or in the hermitage, whether I'm alone or surrounded by people, I remain in solitude. I remain silent, not in speech, but in my heart. The words sank deep into the minds of the disciples. Some looked troubled, others contemplative. But all of them, in that moment, knew that they had glimpsed something rare, a truth that could not be given, only discovered. The teacher stood, signaling the end of the discussion. Go, he said. Sit in silence. Do not try to force it. Do not try to understand it. Simply listen. If you truly listen, one day you will hear the silence that has always been there. The disciples bowed, each lost in thought and dispersed. And as they walked away for the first time, they did not speak. As the disciples dispersed, A stillness settled over the hermitage, one that was different from any silence they had known before. It was not the forced quiet of discipline or the restraint of an imposed vow. It was a silence born of awareness. Each step they took was measured, each breath felt, each movement mindful. It was as though, for the first time, they had truly begun to listen, not just to the world around them, but to the spaces in between, to the stillness beneath the noise. The disciple who had returned from the forest sat alone beneath a tree, watching the gentle sway of the leaves in the afternoon breeze. His mind was quiet, yet not empty. Thoughts still arose, but they no longer carried him away. They came and they went, like ripples upon a vast and undisturbed lake. A young disciple approached hesitantly and sat beside him. The returned disciple did not speak, but acknowledged his presence with a simple nod. The younger man took a deep breath before finally asking, "When you left for the forest, did you think you would ever return?" The former talker thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said. "When I left, I did not know what I was seeking. I only knew that I could not find it here, not while I was surrounded by the voices of others, and not while my own voice was the loudest of them all." The young disciple looked down, tracing patterns in the dirt with his fingers. "And did you find what you were looking for?" The elder disciple turned his gaze to the sky, as if searching for the right words. "I did not find anything," he said at last. "But something was revealed to me, something that had always been there, waiting in the silence." The younger disciple frowned. "I don't understand." The elder smiled. "Neither did I for a long time. But understanding is not something that comes from words. It comes from experience. You must let go of the need to grasp at knowledge. Let go of the idea that wisdom is something to be possessed. It is not. It is something to be uncovered." The younger disciple let out a frustrated sigh. "But how? How do I uncover it?" The former talker chuckled softly. "By doing nothing." The young disciple blinked. "Nothing?" "Nothing," the elder confirmed. "Stop trying to understand. Stop trying to silence your mind. Stop trying to force yourself into stillness. Instead, simply be. Be here, be present, be aware. Listen, but do not strain to hear. Observe, but do not analyze. Let the world unfold before you, and in time, the silence will reveal itself." The younger disciple looked doubtful, but he did not argue. Instead, he sat quietly beside the elder, watching the way the wind moved through the trees, the way the sunlight danced on the leaves. And for the first time in his life, he did not try to explain it. He did not try to capture it with words. He simply watched. Days passed, and the lessons of silence began to take root in the hermitage. The disciples spoke less, but when they did speak, their words carried weight. Their movements became slower, more deliberate, their presence more grounded. The hermitage itself seemed to breathe with a new rhythm, one that was calmer, deeper. But not all the disciples found the path easy. There were still those who struggled, those who felt restless in the stillness, who longed for something more tangible, something they could hold on to. One such disciple approached the teacher one evening, frustration written across his face. "Master," he said, "I have done as you instructed. I have sat in silence, I have listened, I have observed. But still my mind is not at peace. I do not feel the silence that others speak of. I only feel emptiness." The teacher regarded him for a long moment before answering. "Then perhaps that emptiness is what you need to feel." The disciple's frustration deepened. "But I do not want to feel empty. I want to feel peace." The teacher nodded. "And that is why you do not find it. You seek peace as if it is something outside of yourself, something to be gained. But peace is not a prize to be won. It is not a reward for stillness. It is the stillness itself, The disciple looked away, his hands curling into fists. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The teacher smiled gently. "Nothing." The disciple let out a frustrated laugh. "You sound just like the elder disciple. He told me the same thing." The teacher's eyes twinkled with amusement. "And did you listen?" The disciple hesitated. I tried." The teacher shook his head. You did not try. You fought. You struggled. You sought an answer where none was needed. You are still trying to control the silence. You wish to mold it, to shape it into something comforting. But silence is not meant to be controlled. It is meant to be experienced. The disciple's breath caught in his throat. "So, I should just stop?" The teacher nodded. "Yes. Stop resisting. Stop seeking. Stop trying to shape the silence into what you want it to be. Let it be what it is." The disciple closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling in deep, measured breaths. And for the first time, he did not try to force the silence. He did not try to understand it. He simply let it be. And in that moment, the stillness embraced him. That night, as the hermitage lay wrapped in the hush of twilight, a new understanding settled over the disciples. They no longer feared the silence. They no longer sought to escape it. Instead, they welcomed it, allowing it to fill the spaces between their thoughts, between their words, between their very breaths. And in that silence, they found something they had never known before. Not absence, not emptiness, but presence. A presence so vast, so boundless, that it could not be contained in words. And so, for the first time, they did not try. They simply remained, silent, at peace. As the days passed in the hermitage, something had shifted. The air itself seemed to carry a different energy, as though the very earth beneath them had absorbed the stillness and now pulsed with a quiet rhythm. The disciples, once so accustomed to constant discussion, no longer felt the need to fill the silence. And yet, in that very silence, a deeper awareness had begun to emerge. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky with hues of amber and violet, the disciple who had returned from the forest sat alone, his eyes tracing the patterns of the wind in the grass. The teacher approached him, his steps soundless on the earth. "You have come far," the teacher said, settling beside him. The disciple nodded. "And yet, Master, I feel as though I have only just begun." The teacher smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "That is how it always is. The further you go, the more you realize how little there is to reach." The disciple pondered these words for a moment before speaking again. "Master, I have seen the power of silence. I have felt its depth. But I wonder, what is the purpose of speaking then? If silence is the key to peace, should we not abandon words altogether?" The teacher let out a soft chuckle. "Ah, a common misunderstanding. Silence is not the rejection of words. It is the mastery of them." The disciple turned to look at him, listening intently. The teacher continued, "Imagine a musician. If he plays every note at once, does he create music?" The disciple shook his head. "No, he creates noise." "Exactly," the teacher said. "And if he were to never play at all, would there be music?" The disciple frowned. "No, there would only be silence." The teacher nodded. "Silence alone is not wisdom. Speaking alone is not wisdom. It is knowing when to be silent and when to speak that reveals true wisdom. A skilled musician does not play endlessly, nor does he remain in silence forever. He knows when to let the music rise and when to let the stillness settle between the notes. That is what makes it beautiful." The disciple absorbed these words, his mind quiet. The teacher continued, "Most people speak not to communicate, but to fill the void. They speak to be heard, not to understand. They use words to escape their own discomfort. But when one has mastered silence, his words gain meaning. He does not speak because he must. He speaks because there is something worth saying. And that, my student, is the difference between noise and wisdom. The disciple exhaled deeply, as though releasing a weight he had not realized he was carrying. Then how does one know when to speak? The teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. When your words serve something greater than yourself. A hush fell over them as the evening wind whispered through the trees. The disciple understood now. It was not speech itself that caused suffering, but the lack of awareness behind it. It was the endless need to prove oneself, to assert opinions, to control how others perceived them. But when the ego fell silent, words became what they were always meant to be: a bridge between hearts, a path to understanding, a tool for kindness rather than division. That night, as the disciples gathered for their evening meditation, they noticed the difference in their own presence. When one of them spoke, the others truly listened, not with the intent to reply, but with the intent to understand. The words exchanged carried weight. And then a test came. A traveling sage arrived at the hermitage. He was known across the land for his eloquence, his ability to debate with sharpness and precision. His words could cut like a blade or soothe like a balm, and he prided himself on his skill. He stood before the teacher and the disciples, his voice ringing out in challenge. I have debated with many scholars, tested the wisdom of kings, and outwitted the most learned of men. But I have heard whispers of this place, of your silence. And so I have come to ask, what wisdom can be found in the absence of words? The disciples exchanged glances, waiting for their teacher's response. But the teacher only smiled, his eyes twinkling with something unreadable. The sage continued, undeterred. Silence is the refuge of those who have nothing to say. Those who cannot defend their beliefs hide behind stillness, pretending it is wisdom. But true wisdom is proven in words, in the strength of argument, in the power of persuasion. Still, the teacher did not answer. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. The sage shifted, clearly expecting a rebuttal, a counterpoint, something to engage with. But the teacher simply sat, watching, waiting. The sage let out a short laugh, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Is this your strategy, then? To say nothing? To avoid the debate entirely? How convenient. Still, the teacher remained silent. And then something unexpected happened. The sage, who had spent his life in verbal battles, who had mastered the art of argument and persuasion, began to feel something unfamiliar: discomfort. The silence was not passive, it was not empty. It was a presence, vast and immovable, like a mountain unmoved by the wind. And in that silence, the sage felt exposed. Without the shield of words, without the endless stream of rhetoric to fill the space, he was left only with himself. His thoughts, his doubts, the very things he had spent his life avoiding by drowning them in language. The disciples watched as the sage shifted again, his confidence wavering. He looked around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The teacher finally spoke, but only one sentence. When the mind is restless, words are its escape. But when the mind is still, words are unnecessary. The sage inhaled sharply. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The realization struck him like a wave. For all his mastery of speech, for all his knowledge of debate and discourse, he had never truly sat in silence. He had never faced himself without the armor of language, and now, standing before this man who had said almost nothing, he felt as though he had lost a battle he never even realized he was fighting. Without another word, he bowed his head, turned, and left, The disciples sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just witnessed sinking in, and then, slowly, smiles spread across their faces, for they had just seen a truth unfold, not in words, not in argument, but in silence itself. That night, as the stars blinked into existence above the hermitage, the disciples understood more deeply than ever before. The greatest wisdom is not found in the noise of the world, it is found in the spaces between. The night stretched on, vast and infinite, as the hermitage lay wrapped in silence. The disciples sat in quiet contemplation, their minds still absorbing the lesson they had just witnessed. The traveling sage, a man who had built his entire identity on words, had been defeated, not by argument, not by wit, but by the absence of both. The power of silence had unraveled him in ways no debate ever could. One of the disciples, a young man who had long struggled with the need to prove himself, finally spoke. His voice was soft, hesitant. "Master," he said, "what happened today? I did not know silence could hold such power. I did not know that words could be so weak." The teacher shook his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Words are not weak," he said. "It is our attachment to them that makes us weak. We rely on words to shape our reality, to convince others, to assert our place in the world. But the truth does not need convincing, it simply is." The disciple lowered his gaze. "I have spent my life trying to be heard, trying to prove myself through my words. But today, I saw a man who had mastered words, and yet he was powerless in the face of silence." The teacher nodded. Because he had never learned to listen. He had filled his life with so much noise, so many arguments, that he had never faced the stillness within himself. And so, when he was confronted with it, he did not know what to do. The young disciple thought about this for a long time. "And us, Master? How do we know when to speak and when to be silent?" The teacher's eyes gleamed with quiet wisdom. "When your words serve truth, speak. When your words serve only yourself, remain silent." The disciple furrowed his brow. "But how do we know the difference?" The teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "That is why we practice silence, not to abandon words, but to understand them. When the mind is clear, when the ego is quiet, you will know." The disciple nodded, though the weight of the lesson still sat heavy upon him. He knew that his own mind had not yet found such clarity, but he also knew that for the first time he truly wanted to. Days passed, and the lesson of silence continued to unfold in unexpected ways. One afternoon, as the disciples gathered for their daily tasks, an argument broke out between two of them. It was a trivial matter. One had taken something that belonged to the other without asking, and now they stood face to face, their voices raised, each insisting they were right. The returned disciple, the one who had once been the most talkative among them, watched in silence. He did not intervene. He did not try to mediate. He simply observed. At last, when the argument reached a peak, he stepped forward. "You are both wrong," he said simply. The two disciples turned to him, surprised. "How?" one of them asked. "He took what was mine without permission." "And he did not mean harm," the returned disciple replied. "But tell me this, why do you argue? Is it truly to correct the mistake, or is it to be right?" The two disciples exchanged a glance. The returned disciple continued, "If you truly wished to correct the mistake, you would have spoken calmly. But you did not. You raised your voice. You let anger take hold, and in doing so, you lost sight of the truth." One of the arguing disciples frowned. "But should I not stand up for myself?" The returned disciple smiled. "Stand up for yourself, but do not let your words come from anger. If you speak with a restless mind, Your words will only create more restlessness." The two disciples fell silent, shame flickering in their eyes. They bowed their heads and stepped away, the tension between them dissolving as quickly as it had risen. The rest of the disciples watched, understanding dawning upon them. The lesson was becoming clear. Silence was not just about withholding words, it was about knowing their weight. That evening, the teacher called for a gathering beneath the great tree at the heart of the hermitage. The disciples sat in a circle, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. At last, the teacher spoke. "Today, you witnessed the power of silence once more," he said. "You saw how words, when spoken without awareness, create division. And you saw how a single moment of stillness can dissolve it." The disciples nodded. The teacher continued. "Many people believe that wisdom is found in speaking, that the more one speaks, the more they know. But wisdom is not in the words, it is in the space between them." A younger disciple, his heart heavy with reflection, hesitated before asking, "Master, will there ever be a time when silence is not needed?" The teacher's expression softened. "Perhaps. But tell me, do you believe the world is silent?" The disciple frowned. "Number. The world is full of noise." The teacher nodded. "Then silence is needed." A hush fell over the gathering. The teacher continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The world is filled with voices shouting over one another. People speak without listening. They argue without understanding. They fill the air with words, but none of them hold weight. And so, we must learn the art of silence, not to abandon words, but to restore their meaning." The disciples sat still, absorbing the lesson. At last, the teacher looked at the returned disciple. "You left here restless. You returned in stillness. Tell me, what have you learned?" The former talker bowed his head in respect before speaking. "I have learned that the mind is like a pond. When we speak without awareness, we stir the waters, creating ripples that distort everything we see. But when we sit in silence, the surface settles, and only then do we see clearly." The teacher smiled. "And what do you see now?" The former talker looked at his fellow disciples, at the sky above, at the earth beneath him. His breath was steady, his eyes unshaken. "I see everything," he said. The teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you have understood." A deep peace settled over the hermitage that night. The lesson of silence had not been spoken, it had been lived, and for the first time, the disciples did not feel the need to ask more questions. They simply remained, present, aware, silent. The hermitage rested in a profound quiet, not just in the absence of sound, but in the presence of awareness. The disciples moved through their daily routines with a stillness that was unfamiliar, yet deeply settling. Words, once abundant and hurried, were now measured, chosen carefully, spoken with intent. The echoes of past lessons lingered in their minds, shaping their every thought, every interaction. But silence, like all things, would soon be tested. One morning, as the mist curled around the trees and the first rays of sunlight kissed the earth, a man arrived at the gates of the hermitage. He was not like the usual seekers who came in search of wisdom. His robes were tattered, his face etched with exhaustion, his eyes restless with unease. He carried the air of someone who had wandered far but found no peace. The disciples watched as he hesitated before stepping inside. His gaze darted from face to face, searching, measuring. Finally, he turned to the nearest disciple and spoke. "I have heard that this place is one of wisdom," he said, his voice rough with weariness. "I have traveled long, seeking answers, but I find myself doubting that they exist. Tell me, is there anything to be learned here? Or is this place just another illusion?" The disciple, who had once been known for his endless talking, but now measured his words with care, simply smiled. He did not answer. The traveler's brow furrowed. "Why do you not speak? Have you no wisdom to share?" Still, the disciple remained silent. The traveler's irritation grew. "You think yourself superior? Is this silence meant to be a trick, an act to make me feel foolish?" Another disciple approached, his presence calm and unshaken. "You have come seeking answers," he said, "but you are asking the wrong questions." The traveler scoffed. "And what are the right questions?" The disciple gestured to the earth beneath them. "Sit, stay for a while, do nothing, and the right questions will arise on their own." The traveler hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. But something in the disciple's tone, something steady, something unwavering, compelled him to listen. He lowered himself to the ground, though skepticism still clouded his expression. And so, the traveler remained in the hermitage. Days passed. At first he resisted the silence, filling the space with restless movement, with sighs of frustration. But gradually he softened. The rhythm of the hermitage, the ease with which the disciples carried themselves, the stillness that settled over them, it began to seep into his bones. One afternoon, as he sat beneath a great tree, he turned to the disciple who had first greeted him. "I do not understand," he admitted. "This silence, it unsettles me." The disciple, who had once been burdened by the same restlessness, nodded. "That is because you are still waiting for it to give you something. You are treating silence as though it is a lesson to be learned, a problem to be solved, but silence is neither of those things. It is simply a mirror." The traveler frowned. "A mirror?" "Yes. It does not give you answers. It only shows you what is already there." The traveler fell into deep thought. He had spent his life searching, questioning, arguing, always moving, always restless. He had sought wisdom in words, in debates, in endless discussions. But now he was beginning to wonder. Had he ever truly listened? That evening, as the sky deepened into shades of twilight, the traveler approached the teacher of the hermitage. "Master," he said, his voice quieter than before, "I have been here for many days now, and yet I do not know if I have learned anything." The teacher regarded him for a long moment before answering. "Have you found what you were looking for?" The traveler hesitated. "I do not know." The teacher nodded. "Then you are closer than you think." The traveler frowned. "But I do not understand." The teacher smiled. "That is because you are still asking the mind for answers. But the answers you seek are not in the mind, they are in the silence." The traveler let those words settle within him. He did not speak again that night. More days passed. The traveler no longer sought to fill the silence. He did not force himself into stillness, nor did he fight against the thoughts that rose within him. He simply remained, observing, being. And something began to change. One morning, he woke before the sun, stepping outside as the first light broke over the horizon. The world was painted in hues of gold and soft pink, the air cool and alive with the scent of earth. He stood there for a long time, watching, and then something happened. For the first time in his life, he did not name what he saw. He did not think of words to describe it, did not try to capture it in thought. He simply experienced it, and in that moment, the mind fell away. There was no traveler, no search, no need to grasp for meaning. There was only this, only the stillness, only the now. The next day he approached the teacher once more. "Master," he said, "I do not know what has happened to me, but I feel lighter, as though I have been carrying something for years and only now realized I could put it down." The teacher smiled. "That is because you have let go of the need to understand. You have stopped searching for meaning in words and begun to experience it.